Late last year, the Paris Climate Conference ended with hope and celebration. Now comes the hard part, doing what they agreed to do. Joining us now with his views on engineering a more livable future in Calgary, Alberta, David Keith. He's a professor of applied physics at Harvard University and founder of a company called Carbon Engineering. And David, it's always good to have you on TVO. How are you doing tonight?
Very well. Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate you making time for us. The Guardian newspaper, following the COP21 agreement in Paris, said, "Agreement of victory for climate science and ultimate defeat for fossil fuels." Do you see it that categorically as well?
Well, ultimate defeat, yes, in the sense that I think the climate science is real, and if you want a stable climate, you have to stop putting carbon in the atmosphere. So in the very long run, that means a defeat for fossil fuels, yes. But I see the agreement as a step forward, more than we've seen in quite a few years. But it's there's still a very, very long way to go. It's not a binding agreement. It has some nice transparency mechanisms, but it doesn't deal with many of the things you'd really want in an agreement that had more teeth.
Well, you're quite right. The teeth are not there. The agreement stipulates a quote-unquote long-term goal. And again, here are some of the details here. It commits almost 200 countries to hold the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and, quote, pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Is that doable?
It's technically doable, but I think that's actually the least important part of the agreement. So setting a kind of long-term goal that's a big stretch with no clear way to achieve it is not that meaningful at all. I mean, I could say that I want to be better looking than Matt Damon next year, but how am I going to do it? What's the next step? Is it a realistic goal? It's sort of irrelevant. But I could say I was going to get more exercise. That's a relevant thing. And I think the key parts of this agreement are the national commitments to actually cut emissions, and even more importantly than that, the transparency mechanisms that allow the larger world to look more inside what individual countries are doing to cut emissions. Because the key to any real action on climate is a kind of ratcheting of emissions cuts.
Well, you have this line in the past where you've said most of these events are all about feeling good about being concerned about global warming and not actually doing anything. Covers about 80% of what is happening in this field. Is Paris different from that?
Maybe it's a little different. I think we don't know yet. I mean, it's still in the sort of structure of the UN Framework Convention, which really has been about kind of exhortation without real action. But I think there are signs that are positive, and the key signs are these signs that this business of having both the national commitments, which are binding, but they're national commitments, and the transparency mechanisms, I think those two could end up building into something more useful. Many people think that if we're going to have a real agreement that makes real progress on cutting emissions, you need something like what Bill Nordhaus calls climate clubs. And that would be something where some countries agree to do something like cut emissions by such and such, have a carbon price and such, and they say that countries that are not part of their club face some penalty. And the only real plausible penalty in my mind is something like import duties. I mean, the fact is we don't have a global sovereign. So agreeing to do something without any global sovereign to enforce it is kind of irrelevant. The way real things with force work, like the global trade agreements, are when you have some deal where when you're in the club, you get some benefits, like you don't have to pay these duties.
Do you know if that was under consideration in Paris?
Lots of talk about it by thoughtful people, but there was sort of an agreement beforehand. Paris was kind of pre-wired that Paris wouldn't try and go that far. But the transparency mechanisms allow small groups of countries. So Paris is still under this UN Framework Convention, which inherently is about unanimous agreement among all these countries. And the answer is unanimous agreement means no agreement to do anything interesting. But smaller groups of countries, US and China and some European countries, could now, building on the mechanisms that are here, do more and do something that might approach one of these climate clubs where they say, we will do X, some kind of carbon price, we will evaluate on some interannual basis, and we will put up tariff walls that says if you're not in it, you have to pay this tariff if you're trading into the club that does have it.
You know, of course, the skeptical environmentalist Bjorn Lomborg has said that this Paris Agreement will solve about 1% of the global warming problem. That's his view. Is he right or wrong?
too simplistic. So I think what he's saying, he does the numbers right. What he's saying is if people just did their contribution agreements and then went back to business as usual, it would do very, very little, which is true. But in fact, that kind of forgets both political and technological inertia. So if countries really did their contribution agreements, and I doubt all of them will, but if they did, then they would have had to internally do quite a lot in terms of overcoming some entrenched interests, like the fossil fuel interests that don't want to see this action done, and in terms of building up a bunch of new industries on the ground. And once you do that, it's easier to do the next step. So I think Bjorn is right in a narrow sense, but and he's right in, I think, the bigger sense that this agreement is not all it's cracked up to be. But I think the way he says that is kind of academically right, but not really right.
Well, James Hansen goes even further. This is the so-called father of climate change awareness, who said, quote, "It's just worthless words. There is no action, just promises. As long as fossil fuels appear to be the cheapest fuels out there, they will continue to be burned." You think he's right about that?
I mean, that's certainly true at a global level, but obviously some individual countries, quite a few big ones, do have some, much less than I want or Jim Hansen wants, but do begin to have some real policies that put a price on using the atmosphere as a free waste dump for carbon. So there are places where we actually are beginning to have carbon prices of different kinds. So Jim is right that that's what we need, but there's really no entity to enforce a global carbon price. So it's kind of great, if Jim's implying it would be great to have a global carbon price, well, yeah, it'd be great to have all sorts of things, but there's no global sovereign to impose such a thing. So if you think about how this is actually going to work, if we do get to progress, it's going to look like some large set of countries having stronger internal carbon prices or whatever it is, and then having some mechanism to impel other countries to join. And short of something, I think, kind of crazy and unlikely like war, that mechanism is going to be through trade.
About 5 years ago, you were here in the province of Ontario giving a speech at the Perimeter Institute. And what I'd like to do now is just play a clip of that speech and see what you think 5 years on. Let's roll it, please, Sheldon.
You can make an argument, and I think this is important, that Western democracies have in some ways been incredibly successful in giving people enormous opportunities for consumption and in lots of ways giving people amazing personal freedom. But Western democracies have made it very difficult to do anything that's not about consumption in some form. Very difficult for us to spend any substantial amount of money on some big vision, whether it's protecting our great-great-grandkids from climate change or what have you. More centralized, you might say, undemocratic societies were able to do that. So if you think about the communities in Europe where great cathedrals were built, those cathedrals were built over hundreds of years, and I am not an expert, but my understanding is that in some cases several % of GDP of those communities would have been spent in building those cathedrals on timescales of like 100 years. Now, you could argue that wasn't necessarily a good thing, right? These were serfs, there was somebody in charge, it wasn't democratic. So I'm not suggesting we go back to something so undemocratic, but I do think that our democracies are seemingly unable, and maybe need some reform at their root, to allow us to make any big collective decisions, of which climate is just one example.
Okay, that was 2011. It's now 2016. Do you still agree with yourself?
I'd have to say yes. I mean, that was kind of brash, but I think in essence it's true. I think the question is how we get social movements that can get to large-scale commitments. I think one thing that's actually happened in 5 years is the interesting ways in which ground-up social movements are being empowered through new communications media, through peer-to-peer communications, everything, Twitter, Facebook, what have you. And I think it's an open question about whether that will end up just being fluff or really change the way politics works in some deeper way, and whether it allows people who share some kind of broad vision about some social outcome like stopping carbon emissions to collaborate better and push their societies to really take action. And I think there's some evidence that that's happening. I think the mainstream big environmental groups have, in many ways, really, while they were saying the right things about climate science and action, have really not been able to energize a broad political commitment to action. And I think I'm personally very interested in the rise of new groups like 350.org or the student divestment movements that are clearly a new and more decentralized tack on organizing for environmental outcomes. And at this point, it's too early to say whether they'll really do something, but I'm optimistic that at least it's new.
Well, let me ask you about another group of people. This group, and you know one of them very well, is among the richest people in the whole world. This is the Jeff Bezoses, the George Soroses, the Mark Zuckerbergs, Bill Gates, whom you know, 24 others. They've announced the formation of this so-called Breakthrough Energy Coalition. What is the breakthrough that they are looking for?
Scalable technologies that can really take a deep bite out of the climate problem. So the insight is that while we have in the last decade or so made enormous progress in increasing subsidies, say subsidies for solar power or wind power, and that's been a good thing overall, we've done very little to increase the R&D. So we both need to do more applying the technologies we have, but we can't go all the way to zero emissions on the technologies we have. We need some new technologies. And the idea behind both Breakthrough Coalition and the public effort, Mission Innovation, and those two were linked, and Bill Gates actually had a role in getting both going. The insight for both of those is that we need a much stronger commitment to R&D to develop said technologies that can really take a huge bite out of the problem. But to be clear, Bill and the other people involved know that technology alone doesn't solve it. You need both technology plus policy.
David, as we suggested earlier, you know Bill Gates because he's an investor in your company, Carbon Engineering. What does that company do?
We're a startup company trying to find ways to take CO2 out of the air and combine it with energy like solar power or nuclear power to make fuels that would be divorced from oil, not oil, fuels that are high energy fuels that could power, say, transportation like aircraft, and do it with a low land use footprint and no carbon footprint.
If everything goes according to Hoyle, what do you hope that will achieve?
Well, us and other competitors would then provide a useful pathway for decarbonizing some of the heavy end of the transportation system, like aircraft, that cannot be easily electrified through batteries.
Let me get you back to that coalition again for a second. What is it? I guess I need a better understanding of what it is that money from people like Gates can do that you think that money from governments all over the world either can't do or won't do. Help us understand that.
Well, first of all, government money is very important. As I said, there were two things announced, and they were linked, and they're both really important. One is Mission Innovation, which was a set of governments, some of the most important, largest governments in the world, committed to double their funding for clean energy R&D, a certain definition, but a really significant increase. And that's actually the biggest thing, and Bill, to his enormous credit, his kind of personal lobbying power, working with a bunch of different heads of state, helped to make that happen, although ultimately, of course, it's their decision. And that's a broad global commitment to do that. And then separately, there's Breakthrough Energy Coalition, which was putting some extra, it's much less than the public money, private money on the table, is a way to put money into startups and other commercial ventures that would help to commercialize some of these ideas that would hopefully come out of long-term public R&D. But there's no question that one of the central things we need is long-term public R&D, which has public benefits, making it easier to find ways to decarbonize our economies.
So they have two distinctive missions then, is that right?
Well, there's two entities.
Two entities,
Mission
two
Innovation
missions. Okay.
and Breakthrough Energy Partners.
Okay, gotcha. Let me ask you more directly about solar radiation management, which is, am I right to say that is, in fact, geoengineering? For sure.
Okay. So I do lots of academic work. My main academic focus is on solar geoengineering. So it's technically possible to slow down or even stop some parts of global climate change by making the Earth a little bit more reflective. So the climate problem is caused by heat-trapping gases building up from our carbon emissions, and you can temporarily and imperfectly offset some of the climate risk that comes from building up those emissions by making the Earth more reflective so that it cools down a little bit, and this can help to reduce both temperature change and changes in precipitation and rise in sea level and so on. This is inherently temporary. It's something you have to keep doing. It can't compensate for all the risks of CO2 in the atmosphere, but it can compensate for some. And that can allow humanity to get to outcomes you cannot get to by cutting emissions alone. So if you cut emissions, all you can do is stop making the problem worse, which we must do. But doing solar geoengineering might allow you to make the problem better. So for example, it might allow you to keep under a 1-degree target by 2050 or 2100.
Now I gather there are several people who have a problem with this. What's the nature of their objections to that approach?
So this idea, first of all, is old. It's been around since the 1960s, and it's deeply controversial, so much so that in fact there are no large-scale national research programs. And I think the underlying central concern is a concern related to something that people, I think, kind of incorrectly call moral hazard. It's the idea that if we have this potential technical fix out there, not that it is a perfect fix, that it'll reduce the political force to cut emissions. And I think that's a very reasonable fear because we must cut emissions. This technology, solar geoengineering, is a supplement to cutting emissions, not a substitute for cutting emissions. And so I think the central fears around it are fears that it'll be overhyped in a way that takes our eye off the ball of cutting emissions.
Do you think
and I share that fear, but
okay.
I don't think it is a reason not to have a serious research program to figure out how well these things work or don't work.
Well, I was interested in asking you about it because from what I hear, you're getting threats on that. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's a pretty separate thing. There is a community of people who believe, some of them call it chemtrails, they have different names for it, who believe that this is already happening. This is a conspiracy theory. It's not something that sort of normal, rational people think is happening. But there is a community which, by polling, appears to be a few percent of, say, North Americans, believe that the government is already doing this, either for climate or maybe for mass extermination or mind control. People have different theories in this, this community of conspiracy theorists. And they believe they've sort of conflated these two ideas, and so since I'm one of the scientists active in geoengineering, which, I mean, to be clear, is not happening, but if you believe it already is, and you believe I'm an advocate for it, then I'm an advocate for mass murder, and if you believe I'm an advocate for mass murder, then it might be good to kill me. So there are people who think that, but that's completely outside of the mainstream debate.
Have you taken steps, or have you felt a need to take steps to protect yourself?
Well, there's not really much a public person could do to protect themselves, so no.
But I gather you still think that this kind of two-track approach is the best way to go. On the one hand, attacking climate change in the way that you've described, and then on the second hand, you can do geoengineering at the same time, and one hand washes the other. Is that right?
Well, it's really a multi-track approach. There's no single answer to the climate dilemma. I mean, we need to change our politics to deal with a problem like this, because no amount of technology will solve this problem unless people really have a larger commitment to solve it, to come back to where we started. We need to cut emissions. We need to find ways to adapt and to reduce the climate threats, especially the most vulnerable, through deliberate adaptation methods. We need to at least be able to do solar geoengineering, in my opinion, and if it works as well as we think, I think we should do it as part of a combined solution. And also, in the long run, we might want to remove carbon if humanity wants to bring the climate back towards the pre-industrial, say, in 2 lifetimes from now. So there's a whole range of things to do, not just one.
Did you read Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything?
I didn't read the whole book. I've looked at bits of it.
Looked at bits of it. Okay, let me do the same thing then. Let me read a little bit of it to you right now.
Sure.
She said, fear can't be the driver when talking about our motives for climate change. She said that's the big mistake the environmental movement made. But then a few paragraphs later, she goes on to say, a lot of the way we communicate climate change doesn't acknowledge the emotional side of it. So I thought it was best to write about my own raw terror. Okay, so on the one hand, not fear, but then on the other hand, yes, terror. And, some people might find that approach a little bit confusing, so I would ask you, what do you think the right emotional stance is vis-a-vis tackling climate change?
That's a great question. I do think Naomi is confusing on that. I think that she mostly does sell fear, and I think from what I can tell, she cares about a certain set of social changes that I actually partly agree with, and she sort of is seizing on climate as a way to show that the current world is unsustainable, and so we should make these social changes. There's no single emotion that's right. This is a world with billions of people, and there's billions of people yet not living who will be affected by climate change. So in a sense, there's no reasonable answer to that question. I think fear is certainly one of the right emotions, but other ones are, I think, love, the idea that we care about the natural environment that came to us from billions of years of evolution, and that we want to leave our grandkids with and great-grandkids with more of a chance to see the world as it was. So I see it as partly the protective impulse that comes from loving the natural world.
How about raw terror? Do you think that's appropriate?
This may come out of like what your background is and where your set point is for terror. But to me, if I think terror, I think nuclear war, biological war, robot wars, which I don't think are all way out there things. I think those are things that have, non-trivial probabilities this century. So those are where I have terror pegged, and I can't think of anything. Climate is inherently a pretty slow-moving thing. I think it's the worst global environmental problem we have by some measures. It's the problem I've spent my entire professional career on. I could hardly care more about it, but I don't see it as quite getting to the terror level.
Okay. David, let's finish up on this. It may well be that each individual watching this program right now says, this is a problem that is just bigger than me. And no matter what I do individually, it's not going to make that much difference. Are they right to think that?
No. Individual people make lots of differences, and most of all by speaking out. So it's true that this problem, to solve it, requires collective action. That is, no individual action does it. We have to act collectively to limit our emissions and do the other kinds of things we're talking about. But individual people can profoundly influence their fellow beings, their neighbors. And so that can be true through normal politics. So, one thing you can do is go tell your member of parliament that you really care about this topic, whatever party they're in. Just give them the message that you care, that you want to see something done. But also you can think about different ways to organize your fellow citizens to do things. And lots of people do that, including lots of people who don't think of themselves as explicitly political. So I think there's lots of ways to do it, but it is true that ultimately it is about political action, and it's about weakening the forces that want to oppose action. So there are lots of totally great people in the oil and gas industry. I don't think they're in general any better or worse than any other people, but there's no question that as an industry, they of course, in their self-interest, as in a narrow sense they should be, are fighting against action. And so we need to shift political power in favor of action to restrict emissions.
Understood. David, it's always good of you to join us on TVO. Thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
David Keith, Harvard University, and the founder of Carbon Engineering.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.